I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, this is Steve.
This is Cara.
And we'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Innkeepers podcast.
Yes, today we are super excited that we get to have Karen DeGraaf join us from the Cameroon.
Yeah.
She is a counselor that works with Wycliffe Bible translators. She and her husband have been with Wycliffe since she was 22. They were both doing training in linguistic research in French-speaking West Africa for many years. They spent 11 years in Côte d'Ivoire. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Ivory Coast.
Ivory Coast, yeah.
And West Africa, and they had 3 children there. And then in 2002, they had to leave when there was a civil war that tore apart the country. And Karen at that time made the shift and decided to go into counseling. Mm-hmm. She did a degree at Western Seminary. We actually overlapped for a year or so. And then she and her husband ended up serving some time at Wycliffe Jar Center in North Carolina. And then they eventually were able to go to Cameroon, and that's where they're working today. So she is the Africa Area Counseling Coordinator, and she specializes in working with missionaries in the areas of depression, anxiety, trauma recovery, stress, burnout, and relationship transitions, all the grief and loss, those hard issues that missionaries face.
Yeah, and I think she mentions in the interview that she's one of 2 people responsible for Africa.
Yeah, it's a big job. So she is going to be talking with us today, and it's just really a privilege to have her on our show and hear her perspective on missionary care happening on the field.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. Let's get started.
Hello, Karen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello.
I would love to hear a little bit more about your experience. If you could share with our guests what your missionary story has been.
Well, first of all, I always knew all the way through high school that I was never going to be a missionary, and I was never going to do anything like what my parents did. None of their jobs. So, that I knew for sure. So I grew up in a very Christian home. I'm an only child. My parents are both public servants. My mom is a public health nurse, and my dad was a social worker with the VA for 30 some years. And I was just surrounded by, missions were something they, were always supporting and interested in. They had some friends who were missionaries. I just always knew that wasn't for me. And then after high school and in early college, I kind of got, God sort of blindsided me and changed my path, and kind of helped me see that what I was really most passionate about was the word of truth and people. And so where those came together for me in kind of a miraculous series of events was the work of Bible translation around the world. And I'd always known about Wycliffe Bible translators because I think my parents got their mailing or something. And so about midway through college, I think I was 21, I went through my first introduction courses to linguistics, to translation training with Wycliffe Bible translators, and decided that was exactly where I was supposed to be. It just felt like such a fit. I remember that summer calling, and it was held in Eugene, Oregon. And I'm a native of Eugene, Oregon, and I mostly grew up in there, and then also Portland and Vancouver area of Oregon. And so it was real close to home. I had taken a year out of college to kind of find direction, and this was a good way to kind of get going again. And it was fascinating. The people I met, it just felt like I fit there. I called my parents one day and said, I think I'm going to join Wycliffe Bible Translators. And my mom said, oh, that's great. I've been praying since you were in junior high that you would do that. And I was like, are you kidding me? So fortunately, she never told me, which is good, because I probably would have been very suspicious otherwise. Just because, I was not going to do anything that they were doing. Not because it was bad, it's just I knew I didn't want to do that. So
you wanted to make your path.
Yeah, right. I'm a very independent only child. I can do it myself. That's kind of my mantra. So during some of that SIL Wycliffe training, I was thinking I'd go to French-speaking Africa, because I had some French training already. I loved learning languages, and I loved French, and I'd been learning it. And so I was tentatively slated to be trained to go to do some language survey work in West Africa. And then the next year that I took my following courses for training, I met a guy who was also going to West Africa and was a little further along in the process, but it just seemed quite inevitable that we needed to go together. And so we got married the following summer, and then took another year, and we were assigned to Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa. In the early 90s, we spent a year doing French language study in France, which was a total blast. And ended up, we had no children at the time, which was the best way to do it, because it was super, super stressful for families with kids. But then we got to Cote d'Ivoire, and we got assigned to a project, and we started language learning and cultural learning. And my husband had already been there, actually in that same language area, for a year and a half with a different organization a few years earlier. So he kind of had a head start in the language and in culture and in relationships, which was amazing. And in those first 3 years or so, we had all three of our children, had a daughter and then twin boys 22 months later, and then kind of finished our language learning phase, and boom, that was our first term. And then for the next 6-7 years, we worked on translation and on linguistic research and on literacy development, which is what our organization does. And then I became I took a leadership position, leading and organizing, planning our different language programs in the country. So there were about 22 to 25 different language projects going on. And we moved to the big city in the south of Cote d'Ivoire called Abidjan, and lived there for a couple of years. But then all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, because it was slowly happening, there was a coup d'etat and a civil war, and we had to leave. We had to evacuate. And so what we thought would be forever suddenly ended, and we ended up back in the States. And that's the time that I ended up retooling and made the very logical and obvious shift from being a translator linguist to becoming a counselor. So that's just where it seemed for the best place for me to go. It seemed where God was leading me to continue focusing.
And I think then that's when your paths crossed with Cara at Western Seminary.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, it was 2 or 3 years in, 2 years maybe into my program. We met up, and so that was fun. It was fun to get to know her, and I think we did a mental health and missions conference together at least once. Back in the day, and I was just finishing my program and getting licensure hours, and was still with Wycliffe, and my husband still had an assignment he was doing from distance and traveling a lot, and then I spent some time kind of interning under a Wycliffe counselor and living and working in North Carolina for quite a while. And then in 2016, we were able to come back to Africa, to Cameroon, and be based here in Yaoundé. So now I'm a counselor here in Yaoundé, and I coordinate our organization's counseling services for all of Africa, which sounds grander than it is. We only have 2 people on the continent right now serving in counseling, but that doesn't mean the needs are fewer. So
probably a lot of needs and not enough ways to service them.
Yeah. So Karen, the more that we interview and talk with missionary guests, the more I realize the reality of climate and culture and all kinds of things that impact the families in their place of service. Can you talk a little bit about West Africa and some of the things that create some struggles, challenges for serving where you are?
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny, it's not only the expats who complain about climate. Really, it's the local people too. The nationals are like, oh, it's so hot, and I couldn't sleep last night. It was so hot. Actually, right now it is dry season in most places. That means, we have a humidity factor of maybe 30%, and it gets it's hovering around 90 degrees. And that's hot for here. Where I live in Yaoundé, we actually are at about 2,100 feet elevation. But in so much of West Africa and Central Africa, down at a sea level or just flat, it's super, super hot and humid most of the time. Just really uncomfortable and unpleasant. And if it's a physical stress and a physical stressor. Some people endure it less easily than others. People from Florida who come out to West Africa and live in the tropics, they love it because they're so used to it. Yeah, we see differences.
Yeah, we've had discussions with other guests about matching people's place of service with their climate that they grew up with.
Yeah, I mean, that's nice if it's possible. I wouldn't try to do that necessarily. People need to know what they're going into and what, they need to figure out how to adapt. And sometimes though, for physical reasons, if there are reasons, there are sometimes people just can't endure the heat and climate. And we have several friends that was true for. Yeah. They just needed to find a different place. It was just unsustainable, I think is the word.
Yeah, so kind of piggybacking on that then, and you've sort of touched on it, what are some of the things that do make it hard for missionaries today? We can talk about Cameroon in particular, but as you work with missionaries all over Africa, what are some of the challenges and struggles that maybe make it difficult for them to remain in their place of service?
There's a lot. As I was thinking through this, some are just plain the obvious, like health issues. We face constant threat of malaria in most places. Some people get really lax in taking the medication that can help prevent it. And they just rely on taking a treatment. And unfortunately, that doesn't always work. I mean, malaria mosquitoes are kind of like COVID. They adapt and they have variants and they get used to what's being used against them. There are also other parasitic borne diseases that are just rife, like things like dengue fever and chikungunya, and then other kinds of sicknesses. There's giardia, there's foodborne illnesses, much more common. We currently have a cholera outbreak here in Cameroon. Often there are other viruses that meningitis is a threat. And there are some vaccination programs for the local people, and often a lot of them are very successful, but often people are just distrustful of government. We also, stress overload, and people just aren't understanding how to manage well. They forget to take into account how much more it just takes to just plain live. It takes more to go get your groceries and to get your food clean and to prepare it and even to just dispose of your garbage. It's just, there are more steps to everything. Insecurity, we've got a lot of increasing all across West Africa. There are more and more what we call red zones, where Western expats especially are generally not allowed to go because of threat of attack, kidnapping, usually jihadist groups. That's happening currently in the far north of Cameroon, part of Boko Haram. People are in danger. People have had to leave their location of assignment because that was in a dangerous area. So we have a lot of sort of displaced people in the cities now, people, even expats who can't live where they normally were, so they have to figure out how to work by distance.
Hmm.
Sometimes kids, definitely children are a factor.
Mhm.
Kids' education needs have kind of, especially for our European colleagues, there would be a point around high school when people would just have to return to Europe
Right.
because there was no option for their education needs, or sometimes health too. Sometimes for older missionaries, when their kids have left home and started their own families, that pull of the grandkids kind of
Sure.
Yeah.
helps them make a decision and relocate. We are seeing a lot more people leaving the field, but actually continuing to work remotely, which, because of better internet connections and Zoom and various platforms that allow us to do that, it really is kind of amazing that people can not be on location but still carry on and be helpful.
Yeah.
And I think another reason, just missionaries can't stay on the field if their financial support is too low.
Mhm.
Occasionally that happens, and people just, they can't manage to spend what they need to be healthy. Unfortunately, often they're not the ones who realize that. It's someone else who has to point it out to them because they're very determined. And sometimes, yeah, it just the ongoing stress and burnout, maybe not being able to do the role that they came for various reasons.
Hmm. Okay.
There's a lot of reasons, a lot of barriers that make it hard. So it's a testimony to God's grace and incredible resilience when people do stay. Sounds like.
I'll say one more that's really important, that's happening more and more, is governments in Africa are requiring things of foreign NGOs and missions that make it nearly impossible for them to stay, like 100% income tax, or
Oh, wow.
making it super hard for expats to get work permits. So we've had entire expat teams have to leave at least 2 major countries in Africa because of things like that, and they've had to figure out different ways of working. So that's a big one. Yeah.
Wow. So what are some of the blessings or gifts of living in West Africa? I know it's not all hard and bad. Some of them are wonderful. What would you share?
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe I'll start on a very sort of mundane level, but I mean, honestly, we've got mangoes, right? Mangoes and papayas and avocados and passion fruit and pineapple. That's super cheap and it's really good and it's fresh. I think you can get that, right? There's some beautiful aspects of nature, even in the middle of a city, if you have the eyes to see them. It never gets freezing cold. We don't need 2 wardrobes. I get to wear flip-flops and sandals all year long. I never have to put on socks, which I love. I just love that. But and also being away from some of the issues in the US these days, not being constantly surrounded by news. You can be, we get internet, we can stream YouTube news or whatever if we want, but I don't need to do that, and it's not hitting me from everywhere.
Mhm.
And being able to have a much more global perspective on global news and current events, learning more. I'd say a broader experience and view of cultures and the way people live, especially as kids are raised to understand that. They just have a bigger perspective on, what is possible, what's acceptable, what the church is, what the church can be, how faith can be practiced, building cross-cultural relationships with our colleagues who are brothers and sisters in Christ, and kind of humbly watching the faith, or I should say seeing the faith of many who have what seem to us to be very hard lives, and that is a humbling process. And I think it's good for us. I think also the pace of life is just slower here.
Yeah.
Not necessarily less stressful, but slower.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
There's always, yes, I totally agree. I've been to enough countries that I realize
Yeah,
pace of life is not necessarily the norm.
right.
No, it's just good to hear from your perspective that, that's being on the field, there is both the hard and the good, and live in tension.
Mhm.
So as
Oh,
you,
and I don't have to own a car or maintain a vehicle. I can get everywhere I need to in the city in a taxi for less than a couple bucks.
Mhm.
And so that means I don't have to drive through the crazy streets or worry about, hitting someone else or being hit or whatever. So, I mean, that's nice. Can't do that in America,
No.
in most places.
yeah. So what would you say from your years of being a missionary and also working with all these missionaries that you've had the opportunity to work with, what would you say a healthy missionary looks like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's kind of all the person that we desire to be. So I guess I kind of have like my perfect person here sketched out. I don't know if I know any of them, but that'd be great. What
Yeah.
I see in people who do well really is, I think one of the number one things is just the ability to tolerate discomfort and distress,
Mm,
and the expectation that that's going to be happening and that that's okay, and that they have what it takes to do that. Of course, they do have to have what it takes to do that, and that takes building in before they get here, generally, which would be really nice if that happened a lot. Doesn't always.
yeah.
I think also that the attitude, a degree of optimism, of hope, of positivity, and I don't mean just kind of blind optimism or everything's peachy, because it really isn't, but an ability to think that, I'm going to put what I can into this, and I'm trusting God to lead, and I believe that there's a likelihood that good things will happen one way or another. It may not be what I'm thinking. Just an ability to have some hope is super important, and not be pessimistic about everything, which sometimes is hard
Yeah.
when you see so much that's hard around you. Flexibility, adaptability, absolutely. I think that's just kind of par for the course if you're, wanting to train a missionary. Lack of rigidity in lifestyle and work and expectations. It's really hard to say, well, things must be this way or it's no go for me.
Oh, yeah.
And there are people, I mean, there may be some things where that's legitimate, super important values, but often when I see people putting that standard down, it kind of is a demand on everyone else to do what they want. And when it's an issue that is kind of debatable, isn't necessarily a moral or biblical issue. It's like, well, you're saying my way or the highway, and that's going to cause some problems. Cross-culturally, even within cultures, personally. Humility is a big deal. Just being able to learn and not being too averse to change, because change is going to happen.
I'm hearing a lot of that need for flexibility and that you're not in control, and God, but trusting that God is in control and that He's working things out for good.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, and it seems so basic, right? It's just kind of fundamental, but we don't want it to be cliche-ish. We don't want it to be trite. But we do want to really actually believe it and act as if we believe it. Which means that when awful things happen, like, someone dies or there's a big crisis in your organization, or there's a massive restructuring or something, that something in you can still say, this was not what I was expecting. I'm not really loving this right now. I don't know what it means, but I'm gonna believe that God will have some purposes in it, and it's probably not what I'm thinking it might be. I don't know. But the ability to be okay with that, and that's not always obvious.
You've talked about some of the things that are critical and important for missionaries to do well. Let's talk for a minute about sometimes when you realize a missionary isn't doing well. And maybe you notice it, maybe they're not even noticing it, or someone mentions
Right.
you, or you're at a, I would guess you have field conferences, and you're at a field conference and someone pulls you aside and says, hey, I have a concern here about a person or a family. What kinds of things, you talked about the red zone, places you can't go. So like a yellow zone for a family, a red zone for a family.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. And what I wish, and what we actually are trying to do more and more, is help our leadership understand what these things are, so that every level of leadership can, for their supervisees, their subordinates, that they can recognize when these things are happening. And not that no one has to wait until the red flag, gets thrown down and you get taken out of the game. So definitely things like just growing discontent in work and in life. And that comes out one way or another. Attitude changes for the worse. Usually someone who's normally, just kind of equilibrated, sort of neutral, or even occasionally happy and positive, they start getting more irritable, more angry, less tolerance for others and for mistakes or whatever. Lack of focus and motivation for anything that they usually have been motivated for. Sort of a crossover with some of the signs of depression or other.
That's what I was just going to say. It sounds like depression.
Yeah. It may not be fully clinically diagnosable, but some of those features, right, for sure. Withdrawal, absolutely. Withdrawal. And sometimes, especially like our organization is fairly academic in nature, made up of a lot of introverts, very, bulgy brain kind of introverts who like to analyze data or work on computers and stuff. But they also, the healthy ones, have a balance. They have relationships. They're involved in a community or in a church, or at least in their family, at school, whatever. But it's more of a sign of a little bit of danger zone when there's just complete isolation and there's no input, no involvement with others, especially when that increases. That's bad. And increasing interpersonal conflict. The kids, especially if there's a family with children, when the kids are not thriving, are having more and more struggles at school or health-wise, there need to be eyes that are able to see that, who aren't just the parents, because sometimes the parents are very good at seeing any change. But sometimes it's the non-parents involved with the kids who see things better. They see changes in attitude or health or whatever. The last one is probably financial problems. Again, really, really struggling financially.
Money is so much issue with many missionaries. You have these flags that you're looking for. What kind of interventions are you able to do on the field then to help these people?
Well, specifically, a lot of times, when someone themselves notices they're not doing well and they're willing to access counseling, come to us and say, I need an appointment. That's perfect. That's great, right? That's what we want. They're willing, they want help, they want to do something differently. We do face-to-face meetings, just kind of your standard Western style of individual counseling. There's 2 of us here in Yaoundé. We will also respond to requests from people in different parts of Africa who are able to meet online. So we do online appointments. We also work with couples and occasionally with kids. We're able to do that. We're not specialists by any means, but teens and kids sometimes fall into our purview, and we do what we can until we feel like we need to refer on, depending on the situation. We often do we try to do things in terms of psychoeducation, like seminars or workshops, leadership training, might say interpersonal skills for leadership, or a big topic for leadership in Africa is stress and burnout. How to manage stress, how to handle burnout in a context where a lot of our national colleagues, they're locally embedded in the community. They have church commitments, they have family commitments that far exceed our own, being foreigners here. And they often cannot say no to requests or demands. So how in the world can they manage stress? So we try to do some trainings, mentoring with a lot of our African leadership, and more of our African leaders are actually getting interested and involved in staff care, in member care. So that's pretty cool. They see this need. We do, teaching interpersonal skills. Sometimes you mentioned field conferences. Sometimes we're able to attend those to be available if needed for staff. We do a lot of consulting with administration and leadership of our organizations when they have personnel problems and they have questions. Well, how do I handle, this is what's going on. It's a conflict. How do I handle this? We may not personally be involved in that, but we will be advising and consulting the leadership. And more people are able to access online resources and helps. So there can be books, videos, even some YouTube teaching, things like that, or can be helpful. We're trying to find appropriate and effective ways, really, of helping our growing African staff, who may not have the same, understand. They don't have the same understanding of counseling from a Western perspective, or of psychology. If you talk about mental illness in most areas of Africa, people immediately think you're talking about the crazy person who's saying who knows what on the street, and is naked and running around. That's what mental illness is. That can't apply to just your average person. So we're trying to find language and concepts that work better and help them more effectively.
Okay. So thinking primarily of your Western staff, if you've had a meeting or several meetings and you've done some counseling, some face-to-face, but you realize the problem isn't going to get solved, it's going to need to go a little bit further, do you encourage them to return to their home country? Do you send them possibly to another counseling center in another part of the world, or what's kind of the next step there?
Yeah, it really does depend, on what kind of a supportive situation and context they might have in their home country. It seems like you always got to weigh the cost and benefit. What's it going to cost them to leave their situation right now? And it's going to cost, we know that, it's going to be upsetting and a transition and stressful. But if the likelihood that they're going to get better help and more stability back in their home country, more encouragement, more support, more help with the kids, whatever it is, then that's great. And maybe there's another option, like maybe there's another center, like you said, and we frequently referred people to the Olive Tree in Turkey.
Yeah.
And there's Tumaini Counseling Center in Nairobi and Kampala, Uganda. And they can offer further services, much more extensive services than we can, just the two of us here. I'm not a psychiatrist, prescribe meds. Sometimes what people need is a psychiatric specialist to help them through that. And so we will try to find where is it that all those resources that they most need are going to be available, and what's least costly for everybody in the family. There's hardly ever a good solution. I mean, the best case scenario is it's a single person and they're going back to a context where, they have friends and supportive family. They can take the time they need, and it's really not impacting too many other, family members' lives or anything. But that just, the hardest ones are big families, which happens frequently.
Yeah, these situations that they do have a cost in terms of how to to get them help, because there's also a cost of staying if things aren't functioning well.
Oh, huge. Yeah. And the problem is people often aren't looking at the cost to everybody else around them.
Mhm.
If there's a family in dysfunction or in crisis, so many resources are being pulled in to help them that really aren't there for that purpose.
Right.
And they're fine short term, but that's when it goes on long term, that's not sustainable. And unfortunately, anytime leadership says we feel like you need to go home to get help, people tend to feel that they feel like that's punitive.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And the point is never that. It's always with the hope of healing, restoration, health, return, if that's the best thing. But at the moment, it just doesn't feel like that, and that's really hard.
Yeah, because we wouldn't think twice if someone said, hey, you have a severe medical issue and the only place to treat
Right.
XYZ, and so you have to go there.
Yeah, you get medevac.
Right. But we don't make the same equation with an emotional and mental struggle.
Actually, there have been a couple of times when I've told a spouse of a client that, your choices are to stay here and carry on as you have been, and then go back, but with your wife in a body bag, or to go back now and do what's necessary to get the help, that she needs. And I feel like, that had a lot of impact, and maybe a little too much impact, but sometimes people need to have the perspective of, oh my gosh, if we just carry on and try to do what we've been doing, it's going to get worse. So unfortunately, that's sometimes the role that we have, is to point that kind of reality out.
So to switch gears a little bit here, we've been talking about what takes people off the field, but what keeps people on the field? What does resilience look like in missionaries?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Probably are. You may have done a podcast. The work that Jeff Whiteman has done on resilience in missionaries. Whitman, I don't remember. Whiteman. He's done research with a lot of cross-cultural workers to kind of understand what goes into resilience. And he's doing research. He kind of defined what resilience is, but he really said it comes down to a 3-level relationship. Relationship with yourself, relationship with God, and relationship with others. Sounds very simple, and I think to expand on a lot of that, I would say a self-awareness, an awareness of what your own limits are, what your own personal needs are for input. Are you an introvert, an extrovert? How do you refresh yourself? How do you restore? Things like, do you need to spend more time with people? Or a little bit less? Do you need to have some time where you go away at the end of the day and just kind of refill?
Self-care kind
What's your relation? Yeah, basic self-care. Yeah, you just need to know yourself, right? And I think practice some compassion too, because you're never going to do all the things that you want to do. You're always going to have some points of, oh, I really blew that one, especially cross-culturally, right? You're going to make mistakes. I'd say at the end of the day, oh, what did I mistakenly communicate there? That now I got to figure out how to go back and be humble and blah, blah, blah. But that being okay, that has to be okay for you to do. It's just expected. Relationship with God, where is he with you on this journey? What is he asking of you? What is he giving to you? Do you have a loving father kind of relationship? Do you understand grace? And I think that's something I've come up against often, is people are happy giving grace to others.
Yeah.
But they have a hard time receiving God's grace for them, or others' grace. They want to self-criticize, and somehow we're holding ourselves personally to a higher standard than we're holding everyone else. And to to a point, that's a good thing. We need to be careful. We need to have self-reflection and all that. But when we're not even, and I wouldn't use the term self-forgiveness, or I don't know that that's biblical. I think the idea is humbly accepting God's forgiveness of us and others' forgiveness, what they've offered to us. Somehow we don't get to be above all that ourselves.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, ability to relate well to others. That's resilience.
Yeah, I think what you're touching on there with the forgiveness piece, I just think the song that comes to my head is Jesus paid it all. Like he paid their sin, my sins, and none of us are exempt of needing God's grace. And I think that humility, back to what you were talking about, what a healthy missionary looks like, and that humility piece of that we all are in need of God's grace.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one piece of resilience too has to do with the ability of, at least at the end of the day, are you able to take the weight of the world off your own shoulders and let God deal with it for the time that you're asleep? I mean, I think he can handle it, probably, right? And that's a little exaggeration, but seriously, that is so often the mindset. It's like, sweetie, are you realizing that you are doing this to yourself? And that's not necessary. Can you let go of some of that?
Yeah. At I don't know, it's one point in my life, I kept repeating to myself, the Messiah has already come and it wasn't me.
Good. Well, as far as I know. Yeah.
It wasn't me.
And
He
cultivating resilience. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just,
Each other.
he came to take all those burdens, and it's not my responsibility to carry my burdens and everyone else's burdens every minute of every day.
Yeah. Cultivating resilience. The fun thing is all we're learning about brain science, neuroscience, is that our brains are plastic. We can change them. We can change our deeply ingrained thinking patterns that maybe make it harder for us to be resilient. Rigid patterns or negative patterns. We can actually change some of those. We can cultivate a mindset of hope or a mindset of flexibility. And that's a whole other, I mean, that how can we cultivate resilience? That's a whole other podcast, you guys, really.
Well, yeah.
You totally should do it. Yeah. And there's a lot of resources online now, more and more, just talking about brain science and exercises we can do practically to shift from the things that make life more distressing, make it harder, make us weaker in a sense, to the things that make us more resilient, more hopeful, stronger, able to tolerate those difficult things, able to come back from difficult circumstances, stresses, repair.
Yeah, there's a little booklet that we often refer to, and it talks about returning to the place of joy. Also, it's a lot of simple things. There's so much conversation right now about gratitude and how a recitation of things we're grateful for, and a daily compilation of the whole gratitude journal sort of thing, and how that one simple thing can have massive results.
Absolutely. It takes repetition, but like anything, it eventually becomes automatic. You just have to intentionally focus your attention a while. And I've had people come back and say, after I've assigned them, okay, at the end of the day, write down 3 things, that made you happy or that you were thankful for, and why they made you happy. Be detailed as possible. And they eventually come back and say, yeah, I didn't think that was going to help at all, but it really made a difference. Okay, cool.
Yeah. It's great.
It's being able to look for, I think, where God shows up in the middle of the mundane, and seeing that and having that be your focus instead of all the negative.
Yeah, and our brains are naturally wired to look for the negative, to look for the danger, right? Because that's what has kept us safe. And I mean, that's what it needs to be looking for. there people studying neuroscience say, yeah, the negative is like Velcro and the positive is like Teflon. So negative stuff that happens, we latch onto because it feels dangerous and it feels threatening, and we want to figure out how we can avoid it next time. We want to be alert, and that's totally reasonable when it is actually a threat or a danger, right? But the positive stuff just kind of rolls right off of us, and it's harder to install that and to remember, oh yeah, this is what happened. This is what God did in that circumstance, or this is, the happy thing that was part of that larger situation.
Yeah.
Or, we have to really be intentional about that.
Yeah, it's often a reframing or restating of what actually happened, because it could have been maybe a hard experience, but in the end, the result probably a lot of positive outcomes.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. And also that we just need to remember that we do not ever really fully know all the outcomes.
that's true.
Yeah. And some of it we'll see the outcome in heaven. We won't see it here.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, totally.
Well, Karen, we're grateful for your time. Is there just anything you want to add to what you've said before we wrap up our time with you today?
Can I recruit people for Wycliffe?
Yeah, go ahead. Do your plug.
Right. You never know. It's funny that, we're looking for people from all walks of life. It's crazy. We need, and I think more and more this is the case in especially larger overseas mission organizations. We need administrators. We need people who know how to lead people well, manage people well, and not just a bunch of technicians. I mean, I wish I knew who all was listening to this, what kinds of audience you have. If they're overseas experienced people, if they're people interested, probably quite a hodgepodge.
Yeah, we try to just publicize it among those people working with missionaries as well as other. We know we've gotten feedback from a lot of different countries, and so we know there's people listening. But also, we really are trying to get mission, like church mission boards and so on, kind of really interested in actively caring for their missionaries. And so, you have a lot of people retiring right now in the boomer age that have
that's true. Yep.
skills and experience that they could bring into a cross-cultural.
And I just wish, I would love to see as more and more as younger people get involved in cross-cultural work, they get the kind of mentoring and encouragement and training that they really are going to need, and that they're not just going, okay, I need to be there in a year. I have a year and that's all I'm going to do. And as fast as I can get there, that's what I need to do. And not taking the time to build in, to get some evaluation, to get some feedback and say, where do I need to grow so that I really can be resilient? Sometimes some of our organizations are honestly at fault in getting people to the field too fast. Not everyone, but I could name a few, but I won't.
That you want. But it's kind of the nature of the job too, is that it's critical that I get from A to B as quickly as I can. And we found out in our own experience that God had a very different timetable for us than we had ourselves.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. I'm so glad that you are there serving in Cameroon and helping the missionaries that are there know that you have a huge impact, and you walked your own road to be where you are today and been resilient. So thank you for what you and your husband have done, and raising your 3 kids cross-culturally, I'm sure had its own challenges. Just thank you for your time today.
Sometimes.
We will connect again soon.
Well, thanks you guys. And I walked onto your campus last August, I think it was. Absolutely not a living soul was there, but I was with a couple of friends in Welch's. We had lunch and we just started walking around and discovered it. So I want to come back someday with my husband.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, you are welcome.
All right.
Hey, Steve, that was a great conversation with Karen today. what were your thoughts?
Well, I appreciated the fact that she made the effort to meet with us from her balcony in Cameroon, and I really appreciated that. She had a lot of good things to say about the health of a missionary, being able to adapt, be flexible. I appreciated what she said, a lot of humility, because you're in a cross-cultural setting and you're going to make mistakes with your own family as well as with the national workers.
Yeah. She just had, I think, a really wise insight into what a healthy missionary is and what they aren't. And I think it was just a really good kind of conversation around that topic of, we want healthy missionaries, and what does it take, and how can we strive towards that? And she was, I love that she's humble enough to say it's not, she hasn't necessarily met that person, but that we are aiming towards something, and we want health, and what can that look like? And I think that was a good conversation.
Yeah. She just kind of mentioned in passing about sometimes rushing people to the field too quickly without the preparation of all the things they might encounter on the field. So perhaps not enough training before they go.
Yeah, that piece can probably cripple some people on the field. And so we want to prepare them well. We want people to thrive, and we just hope that these podcasts are a resource to help people thrive.
Yeah, we want people to be hopeful, and we want people to be positive, but they have to also be aware of the realities of life on the field and the stress of climate and the stress of everyday life. She just talked about how it takes longer to do everything, and that's outside of America. That's pretty true. It's
pretty much the norm.
Yeah, it's just going to take longer to do everything. So then she mentioned at the end of the day just how the negative things of the day are more like Velcro, and they really stick to us. Positive things are like Teflon, and we can forget those things and they fall away. So to be mindful, to keep a journal, keep some kind of record, and look back on the day and maybe reframe some of those negative experiences and see what the positive was in that experience.
Yeah, see where God is at work. And I think that is so huge for any of us, wherever we are in the world, to recognize that God is at work. Yeah.
And am I giving myself the grace that God has given me? And that's a big thought.
Yeah. Well, thanks for listening and joining us today.
And we're grateful that you are listening to the Innkeepers podcast. Thank you, and please recommend it to your friends. Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.